This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to take a look at Pirates. Caverns of Ixalan is the next standard release set, and we already know the set will feature pirates, just like other Ixalan sets have. I took a look at one of the other prominent creature types on the plane of Ixalan, dinosaurs, a couple weeks ago, so I thought it was only fair that we also look at pirates. Let's start with a brief history of the creature type. It first made an appearance in 1996's Mirage, when it was used for Kukemsa pirates. It didn't get a significant number of cards though until 1999's Mercadian Masks. After that, there was an even longer dry spell, as another pirate didn't get printed until 2017's Aether Revolt. From then on, it became a regularly featured creature type, with the original two Ixalan sets, Ixalan and Rivals of Ixalan, still being the sets that featured them the most prominently. This actually isn't the first time I've done an MTG Top 10 on pirates. I also did it back in the 287th episode of this series, which came out in July of 2020. Obviously, the list has changed a lot over the last 3+ years, so it's time to revisit it. To be eligible for this top 10, a card had to have the pirate creature type, or it had to be able to make a pirate creature token. In all, there were 129 cards eligible for this list, and in this video we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. As usual, when I do an update list, I'll also be taking a look at the cards that made the list the first time around, but didn't make it this time. Here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. First tier top 8s are worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and second tier top 8s are worth 1 point, this includes events like Regional Championships. Alright, let's take a look at the 4 pirates that made the list in 2020 but didn't make it this time, starting with Dead-Eye Tracker, which was at number 10 last time. For 1 black mana, this pirate is a 1/1. It has an activated ability where you tap it and pay 1 generic and a black. Then you can exile 2 cards from your opponent's graveyard and you explore. Explore is a really cool mechanic from original Ixalan. You reveal the top card of your library, and then put that card into your hand if it's a land. If it isn't a land, the tracker gets a +1/+1 counter, and you can choose to put that card back on top or in your graveyard. In other words, it's capable of drawing you cards, giving you card selection, and growing, while also hating on the opposing graveyard. It saw some sporadic play in Standard, a standard that featured God Pharaoh's Gift, the Scarab God, and Search for Azcanta. It was pretty great at disrupting decks that were doing stuff with those cards, but it was also not a regular hate piece in the format. While 4 points was enough for the number 10 spot last time, it took 22 points this time, so the tracker's never going to make its way back on the list. Next, there's Roden Airship. For 2 generic and a blue, it's a 3/1 flyer that can only block creatures with flying. That's definitely not impressive by today's standards, but the airship put up 2 Pro Tour top 8s at the Masks Block Pro Tour. Masks Block was not very powerful to say the least, so a card like this could really shine, especially in a metagame that was dominated by white Rebel decks. Most Rebels were stuck on the ground, so the airship could present a pretty serious clock against them. Obviously enough, the airship hasn't gained any points since that Block Pro Tour, and it has 0 chance to ever make it back on the list. Next, there's Siren Storm Tamer, which was at number 8 last time. For 1 blue mana, this pirate is a 1/1 flyer, and you can pay 1 blue mana and sack it to counter a spell or ability that targets a creature you control. It gained all of its points in standard mono blue aggro and tempo decks, which loaded up on cheap evasive creatures like the Storm Tamer. One of the most powerful things the deck did was stick Curious Obsession on a creature to generate card advantage. The Storm Tamer was both a good target for the aura and a great way to protect another creature who has the aura. It doesn't have any points since rotating out of standard. Vraska Relic Seeker is the last card that was on the 2020 list that isn't on it this time. She fell all the way from her number 6 spot. For 4 generic, a black and a green, Vraska is a 6 loyalty planeswalker. She gets on this list as a result of her +2, which makes a 2/2 pirate with menace. She has a -3 that destroys an artifact, creature, or enchantment, and you get a treasure. She also has an ultimate that's a -10, and it makes a player's life total 1. She can protect herself and pressure the opponent with that +2. She can remove a whole lot of different permanents with her -3. Her -10 isn't particularly impressive, but her other 2 abilities do enough work to make her quite powerful. In her time in Standard, she was played in 3 and 4 color energy decks, as well as Golgari and Sultai midrange. She doesn't have any points since early 2019. Alright, let's move to the list proper, starting with the number 10 card, which is Fanatical Firebrand, which was at number 7 last time. This pirate costs 1 red mana, and it gives you a 1/1 with haste that can tap and sacrifice to do 1 damage to any target. This card is a direct reference to an old school goblin that was once one of the best 1-drops in the game, Mog Fanatic, and it's a pretty cool take on that older card. This goes great in aggro decks, as you can play it on turn 1 and get in for some damage, and then later in the game, you can sacrifice it to pick something off or do the last point of damage to your opponent. Unsurprisingly, the Firebrand has been played in exactly those kinds of decks. In Standard, Pioneer, and Pauper, it isn't gaining points at an incredibly rapid rate or anything. It has only gained 7 over the last 3 years after all, but it's still seeing some play in both Pioneer and Pauper. That said, I think it's a safe bet that some pirates in Caverns of Ixalan will pass the Firebrand in the long run. At number 9, it is Dire Fleet Daredevil, which was at number 5 last time. For 1 generic and a red, this pirate is a 2/1 with First Strike, and its Enter the Battlefield ability is a reverse Snapcaster Mage effect. In other words, it lets you exile an instant or sorcery from your opponent's graveyard, and you can cast it this turn and spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast that spell, then you exile that spell. This has pretty reasonable base stats, and that Enter the Battlefield ability feels pretty awesome when you can cast a cheap removal spell. It was played in a bunch of different red aggro decks, while it was in Standard including Mono Red, Boros, and Gruul. It's also found success in Pioneer Mono Red aggro. It also saw some play in modern human decks between 2019 and 2020. It hasn't gained points anywhere so far this year, and has only gained 2 points over the last 3 years, so it's another pirate that may not be on the list much longer. At number 8, it's Hostage Taker, which was at number 4 last time. For 2 generic, a blue and a black, this pirate is a 2/3, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile another target creature or artifact until Hostage Taker leaves the battlefield. You can cast that card for as long as it remains exiled, and spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. Funnily enough, Wizards of the Coast forgot to put another creature in the text box. It just says creature, so originally Hostage Taker could exile itself, which would create a 1-card infinite loop. They had to issue a day 1 erratum to fix that. Anyway, silly mistake aside, Hostage Taker is a really powerful card. Pretty much all creatures that enter the battlefield and exile something for as long as they stay in play end up being playable in Standard, but this adds a major upgrade to that effect, as you're able to cast the card that gets exiled. This means you can get a 2-for-1, and it also means if you have time to cast that card before the Hostage Taker gets removed, your opponent will never get it back. In Standard, it was played in aggro, mid-range, and control decks. It's also done some significant work in Modern, where it was played in human decks until 2019. These days, it sees the most play in Pioneer, where you can find it in Bring to Light decks. These 5-color decks use the eponymous sorcery to tutor up cards that are good in specific situations. And the deck virtually always runs a single Hostage Taker to grab when an opposing creature is giving you problems. Hostage Taker is going to keep gaining points in the future. At number 7, I've included 2 cards, and they are the first newcomers we've seen on the list, Azure Fleet Admiral and Crimson Fleet Commodore. I included them together because they have an almost identical score, they're played in the same deck, and they have some other obvious similarities. They were both printed in 2020's Commander Legends, and they are both pirates that make you the Monarch when they enter the battlefield. The Commodore is a 4-mana 5/2 Trampler, and the Admiral is a 4-mana 3/3 that can't be blocked by creatures the Monarch controls. If you're the Monarch, you get to draw a card at the beginning of your end step, and whenever a creature deals combat damage to the Monarch, its controller becomes the Monarch. In other words, these both basically draw you a card as part of their Enter the Battlefield ability, in addition to giving you some very real bodies for the board. It's also pretty sweet that the Admiral punishes your opponent a bit for taking the Monarch from you, while also guaranteeing you can always become the Monarch again. Both of these have gained all their points in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal. They tend to both appear in blue-red spell decks in the format, where the card advantage that they can grant is incredibly powerful. They're both in a great spot to continue to gain points in Pauper going forward. At number 6, it's Kite Sail Freebooter, which was at number 2 last time. For 1 generic and a black, the Freebooter is a 1/2 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, you look at your opponent's hand and exile a non-creature non-land card from it, and it remains exiled until the Freebooter leaves the battlefield. This makes it a pretty disruptive 2-drop. It didn't do a ton in Standard, but it was a key card in modern human decks between 2017 and 2022. This deck was of course based around the human creature type, and many of its creatures had disruptive effects, like the Freebooter. That kind of thing made it a lot harder for your opponent to find a way to defend themselves against your onslaught of creatures. However, human decks haven't been a major factor in Modern since 2019, and they haven't been a factor at all since 2020. The Freebooter also has a single point from a Pioneer Humans deck, but it doesn't really have a home right now in any format, so there's a chance it will continue to move lower on the list. At number 5, it's Boarding Party, which is a newcomer to the list. For 5 generic and a red, the party is a 6/3 with haste and cascade. Cascade means that when you cast the party, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less, then you can cast that card without paying its mana cost. So in other words, this 6 mana 6/3 haste is going to give you a 2-for-1, while also smashing in for 6 damage much of the time. The party has gained most of its points in Pauper, which shouldn't be too surprising as this is really powerful for a common. It sees play in a wide variety of decks in the format, but these days its most frequent home is in land destruction decks. The deck simultaneously ramps its mana while crippling opposing mana bases, and casting Boarding Party is often enough to win the game on the spot when your opponent is having a hard time keeping lands in play. Just this year, it's also started to see play in Legacy, where it appears in the Cascade-focused Creative Technique deck. This deck is made up entirely of Creative Technique and cards with Cascade that cost 6 mana or more. In other words, casting Boarding Party and other 6 mana Cascade cards will always allow you to hit Technique. Technique shuffles your library and reveals a card from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land. This will always hit another Cascade card, and you just keep going from there until you have a ton of creatures in play, which can allow you to swing for lethal. Boarding Party is in a great spot to continue gaining points in both Legacy and Pauper, and it may move higher on the list. At number 4, it's Spectral Sailor, which was at number 3 last time. For 1 blue mana, this is a 1/1 flyer with flash. You can also pay 3 generic and a blue to draw a card. That gives you a nice evasive creature with late game value. The Sailor had a variety of homes in Standard, including Simic Flash and Blue-White Control, both decks that look to take advantage of the fact that you could leave mana up during your opponent's turn and still add to the board with this flash creature, or draw cards with it. But it was the most powerful alongside Wilderness Reclamation. This deck abused the mana Reclamation could generate in a variety of ways, and while drawing extra cards with the Sailor isn't as busted as some of the other things the deck could do, the deck was happy to have a mana sink that draws them cards to find themselves a win condition. That deck was so good that Reclamation got banned out of the format, but Spectral Sailor has also seen significant play in Pioneer and Modern, where it's generally featured in Spirit decks. Spirit aggro has been one of the best decks in Pioneer since the format was created in 2019, and that's allowed the Sailor to continue to amass points regularly, and it might be able to move higher on the list in the future. At number 3, it is Kari Zev's Skyship Raider. She was at number 1 last time, but 2 new cards managed to overtake her over the last 3 years. For 1 generic and a red, she's a 1/3 with First Strike and Menace, and when she attacks, she creates a 2/1 Ragavan token that is tapped and attacking. The token gets exiled at the end of combat. Menace and First Strike are a nice combination on a 1/3, as she can just kill X1s before they ever do damage to her, and that's particularly problematic because her monkey friend joining the fight leads to her doling out huge amounts of damage. Unsurprisingly, Kari Zev has been featured in red aggro decks in both Standard and Pioneer, and she's going to keep seeing play in Pioneer in the future, but it feels unlikely she'll ever retake the number 1 slot on the list, as the 2 cards in front of her are seeing way more play than she is. At number 2, it's Hull Breacher, which wasn't printed until a few months after the 2020 list. For 2 generic and a blue, it's a 3/2 with flash with an incredibly punishing ability. If your opponent would draw a card except the first one they would draw in each of their draw steps, instead you get to create a treasure token. In other words, it not only blanks the draw, you get value out of it in the form of mana. Because it has flash, you can even play it in response to a card draw spell and make that card blank while getting extra mana. It was printed in Commander Legends, which means that when it comes to 60-card formats, it's only legal in Legacy and Vintage, but those are both formats with lots of ways to abuse the Breacher. It gets particularly nasty alongside symmetrical card draw, especially wheel effects like Wheel of Fortune, because this lets you reload your hand and get 7 treasure while your opponent just loses their hand. You can then use all that treasure to cast the brand new cards you just drew. It's notable that Hull Breacher is actually banned in Commander, where it gets particularly ridiculous alongside wheel effects, since you can make every single one of your opponents lose their hand and get even more treasure in the process. It's kind of embarrassing that this card was printed with Commander in mind, being in Commander Legends, and it ended up being so busted. Anyway, Hull Breacher is going to keep gaining points in the Eternal formats in the future, and it will be interesting to see if it ever overtakes the number 1 card on the list, which is Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, which is a newcomer to the list. That's right, Kari Zev's monkey friend, who obviously enough later got his own card, is one of the cards that surpassed her. For 1 red mana, Ragavan is a 2/1. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you create a treasure token and exile the top card of your opponent's library. Until end of turn, you can cast that card. He's also got Dash for 1 generic and a red, which means you can cast him for that alternate cost, and he gains haste and then bounces back to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. Ragavan has quickly asserted himself as one of the best 1-drops in the entire game, as he not only brings great stats for the cost, he gives you an absurd amount of value, both letting you steal opposing cards and producing extra mana for you. Ragavan was printed in Modern Horizons 2, which means the only 60-card formats he's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, but he's so good that he's had a huge impact in all 3 of them. In fact, the impact was so big in Legacy that he's banned in that format now. Modern and Vintage continue to be formats where Ragavan is heavily featured though, and that's what has allowed him to end up as the #1 card on this list, despite also being the newest card on it. So those are the top 10 pirates in Magic. If you're interested in getting your hands on some of these powerful creatures, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more top 10s that look at creature types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.